My name is Vern Pierson. I am the elected district attorney in El Dorado County. I'm the immediate past president of the California District Attorneys Association, and I've been a prosecutor for 30 years. I've been both a deputy DA, a deputy attorney general, and for about the last 15 years, the elected prosecutor, as I said, in El Dorado County.
That's awesome. Thank you. Could you maybe share the top reasons why California is facing this homelessness crisis right now?
Yes, and I think the best way to talk about the homelessness crisis that we're experiencing now is to start by recognizing that we've had a homelessness problem for a number of years, and we've all seen it, and we can recognize that housing in California is extraordinarily expensive, and it's only getting more expensive. So that's a factor in this. There's no two ways about it. It is a factor, but to look at the actual root causes of how we went from the numbers we were experiencing 5 to 10 years ago to now, and why we've had this doubling or tripling of the number of people experiencing homelessness. You have to look at go way back to the 60s and 70s, and the root of deinstitutionalization. And it's important to just note that we, not just here in California, but throughout the United States, and in fact throughout the world, has really started in Europe. There was this effort that we needed to recognize we were institutionalizing people in horrible conditions. They were called mental hospitals, but they really were dungeons, probably, for a lack of a better word. And there was people suffering from Down syndrome, suffering from drug addiction, suffering from schizophrenia. They were all placed in the same these institutions, and there was a movement that spread throughout the United States and in fact through Europe, the recognition that that was the wrong way to treat these people, and that they shouldn't be locked up in these types of conditions without any real type of treatment. They were just being warehoused during the course of their lives. So the movement was, let's move them out. And in Europe, they moved very effectively to what they called community treatment facilities. So in every community, there would be a center that could treat drug addiction, treat mental illness. And they had the legal power to tell people, you have to stay in rehab. You have to take your medications, whatever. That's essentially the approach they had. But here in the United States, because of due process concerns, because of a Supreme Court case and some other things, we took a more of a civil liberties type approach in terms of where we said, well, people need to be able to decide what their conditions would be. In California, perhaps it's the worst in the United States, depending on how you look at it, worst or best, in terms of saying we need to show compassion and let people decide for themselves. In what we did was where Europe closed mental hospitals and put people in living in their homes, living with family members, and receiving community treatment. Here in the United States, and in particular in California, what we did was we passed an LPS, or a conservator statute, that said only those who are in the most extreme condition, that they cannot care for themselves or others, and they're essentially dangerous to themselves or others. In those instances, we can insist that they remain in rehab or treatment. And so what ends up happening as a result of that is we closed the mental hospitals, and the people moved out onto the streets, and they lived in the streets. They committed low-level crimes, and they would get arrested for those crimes. And within a relatively short period of time, from about the late 78, 79, 1980, we went from about 28,000 people in prison here in the state of California to, in the early 2000s, approaching 160,000. It's essentially an explosion of people being incarcerated. And depending on the numbers, depending on the studies you look at, between 30 and 50% of those people that were incarcerated were suffering from a significant level of mental illness and or drug addiction. So in other words, we closed the mental hospitals, We put them out on the streets. They committed low-level crimes, and they ended up in jail or prison. We didn't solve a problem. We created, we moved people from what we were calling mental hospitals to jails or prisons. And so I think ultimately there was an increasing recognition that that wasn't right either, that we deinstitutionalized this whole categories of people from what we call the mental hospital and put them in jail or prison instead. And then in the last 8 years or so, we, out of that recognition, say, hey, this isn't the right thing to do. We got too many people in custody that are mentally ill or drug addicted. We did things like Prop 47, realignment, Prop 57, which essentially decriminalized the low-level offenses that this classification of people were typically committing, property crimes, among others. And so once again, we repeated the mistake of the 70s and 80s. And rather than having some type of appropriate treatment, we simply released them from custody. And the result of that is the homelessness, rather, that we see in all of our major cities. Anybody who's walked through Los Angeles, walked through San Francisco, walked through Oakland, and you see the homeless camps there, it's not hard at all to identify that the vast majority of the people are not the types of people who, they're down on their luck, lost their job. They can't afford because housing is so expensive in California. No, a significant percentage of the people that are homeless here in California are those same people suffering from mental illness, often combination of mental illness and drug addiction. Oftentimes where they're suffering from some type of mental illness, they self-medicate using marijuana or other controlled substances. And unfortunately, what's happened at the same time is they've decompensated to where by the time people are getting arrested or they're being conserved, they're in so much worse of a condition than they were before. And it's in my view, it's okay to say it was wrong to institutionalize people the way we did leading up to the 60s and 70s, but you also have to say it's wrong to just pull the rug out of the safety net that the jails and prisons actually served as. And again, I'm not saying that someone who's mentally ill, someone who's drug addicted belongs in jail or prison, because they do not. But you have to have a mechanism to ensure that they're in rehab. You have to have a mechanism to ensure that someone who's suffering from schizophrenia, that the common thing that happens with most people with schizophrenia is they will get on the appropriate medication, appropriate treatment, and then they feel fine, and they refuse to continue taking their medication, and then they decompensate from there. And this pattern is repeated over and over again. So what ended up happening as a result of Prop 47 and realignment as well, is that the best mechanism that was in place was not incarcerating people, but using the threat of incarceration within drug courts and behavioral health court to ensure that the people would stay on treatment programs, say on rehab programs. And the consequence is what we're seeing: the drug addictions, the mental decompensation and increased mental illness, and the people living throughout all of our communities that are mentally ill and not able to function as a result of what's going on.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned court-ordered drug treatment. So what do we know about the effectiveness of court-ordered or mandatory drug treatment?
Well, we know years ago, we were all told that that mandatory drug treatment was not effective and that someone had to voluntarily be ready for drug treatment. What we saw with the drug courts and some of the research that's been done on that is that mandating by the court that someone stay within drug treatment with a consequence of either flash incarceration or some type of minimal incarceration, that was a very effective tool. The drug courts were increasingly working to get people out of custody, get them in rehab, and keep them in rehab. And unfortunately, because of realignment and Prop 47, there's no consequence now. In other words, the court can say, hey, you need to stay in rehab. But the person says, no, I'm not going to do it. I can steal to support my drug habit. And I know that there's no consequence for that here in the state of California. Therefore, you can't make me stay in the treatment. And I think that the research, in my opinion, and what we've seen across California is mandated rehab was effective and far more effective than what we're doing right now, which is essentially nothing. And the consequences, the homelessness that we're seeing on the street.
Thank you. So some people say, well, look at Texas. Their thresholds for felonies, I think it was like 1,300, right? In California, after Prop 47, it's been raised from like $400, $450 to now $950. Yeah. And so some people may use that as an argument, say, well, it's not Prop 47's fault. It's something else's fault. So what do you
and I mean, I've heard those arguments, and I think it's a misunderstanding. It's as though people are comparing California and the way the criminal justice system works here in California to Texas, without regard to the way it works in California and the way it works in Texas. In other words, it's, the common question that people say is, why is it that in Europe, it's less than 10% of the inmates that are in custody are mentally ill or suffering from drug addiction, and yet in the United States, it's between 40 and 50%? What's the difference? Well, the difference is the way the different systems function. And in Texas, if you commit a misdemeanor crime, you actually will serve some type of jail sentence for a misdemeanor crime. In the state of California, and I've been a prosecutor for 30 years, the consequences for misdemeanor crimes are very low or non-existent. And let me put it this way, let me take it out of the property crime realm and look at driving under the influence. Here in the state of California, first offense for driving under influence, you can receive up to 6 months in jail. Second offense, it goes up to a year. Third offense, up to a year, and it could be a felony if it's 4 or more. The practical reality is people who, on the first offense of DUI, driving under the influence, receive very little, if any, time in custody. On the second offense, they generally would receive somewhere between 48 hours and 10 days in jail at most, even though the maximum is up to 6 months. It takes till you get to the third offense for driving under the influence. There's a state mandated minimum amount of time of 120 days in custody. And most of the time, the person still doesn't receive that as a jail sentence. They receive it as some type of alternative sentence where they're on home detention or something like that for the most part. And in the state of Texas, it's very different. If the penalties are actually enforced by courts in a way that's very different than here, because we have a significant difference in overcrowding between California and our jails and prisons. Between California and Texas, it's just very different. And so when I hear those comparisons, it was like, well, if we enforce the law as it relates to misdemeanors the same way Texas does, yes, that would be a valid point, but it's not. It just really is completely misunderstands the differences between the practices within California and the state of Texas. We have, practical, the way to put it is another way to put it is we have an awful lot of lawyers here in the state of California. They've sued the sheriffs who administer the jails. The lawyers have sued the prisons, such that we have capacity caps that are very different here than they are in Texas.
What is capacity caps?
A capacity cap says that you have an institution, let's say for all prisons in the state of California, we have a state or a federally ordered capacity of, I think it's 135,000. So it says you can only have 135,000 inmates altogether within the state prisons. So, and it's a cap, so you cannot go above it. You have to release people if you go above that. Same thing in most jails throughout the state of California. And the way when Jerry Brown was governor and he did what was called AB 109 and realignment was he recognized that it was more expensive to house a low-level offender in state prison than it was in county jail. So the rules changed and said many of these people who were at that time going to state prison will now be housed in county jails. What that did was it drove up the capacity in terms of the number of people that were incarcerated in county jails. And then sheriffs throughout California were forced to release the lower level offenders earlier. So yeah, it's a, most people in Los Angeles County is probably the worst example. And I don't know the exact number right now, but someone that receives a misdemeanor 6-month sentence in jail in LA County is probably going to serve 10 or 15 days before they're released out onto the street because of the capacity limitations that are placed on the jails.
So can we get rid of the capacity cap?
I'm sorry?
Can we get rid of the capacity cap?
Well, we'd have to build more jails, and that's not. I mean, it's very expensive to build jails, and there's very few that are being built.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. So basically, when someone says, "Oh, if you commit a misdemeanor, you can still go to jail for up to 1 year," so that's just in theory. It's not.
It's completely theoretical. It is completely theoretical that someone's actually going to serve anywhere. Driving on used impaired driving, because it is the one area where courts and the criminal justice system have been very specific about. First offense, you're supposed to serve 48 hours. Second offense, you're supposed to serve as much as 10 days. Third offense is supposed to be 120 days. Third offense within a certain 7-year period. And then after that, it's supposed to go up. People actually do serve those types of sentences, but the average person for misdemeanor petty theft. So what is theft under $950? If you're arrested, well, number one, most people in most jurisdictions throughout California are not actually arrested for petty theft under $950. If they're arrested, they would typically be released sooner than the officers would complete writing their police reports because of the amount of time, because they'll be booked and then released, booked and released. And all you have to do is look at, let's say in San Francisco, the number of people who the San Francisco Chronicle did a study, I think it was a year or 2 years ago, about car burglars in terms of people who had broken into cars and how fast they were arrested and how many of them were arrested over and over again. And the numbers were staggering in terms of that it was the same people over and over again breaking into cars, and they all knew there was no consequence in San Francisco for doing that. And part of that, again, goes to jail capacity. Part of it goes to the willingness of judges to enter sentences of consequence, as well as the DAs in the jurisdiction and their approach to dealing with those types of sentences.
Yeah, thank you. So we know that in San Francisco, the DA has openly said we will not prosecute cases involving quality of life crimes, such as public camping, offering solicited sex, public urination, blocking the sidewalk, and other things. So those will all not be prosecuted. So are those kind of decisions, are those made by a DA? So for example, you're a DA, so can you make up your own mind in your district and say, I'm going to prosecute, even though the district attorney in San Francisco decided otherwise?
Well, the system of law that we have in California as it relates to criminal justice, the recent Will Smith, so the slap by Will Smith on Chris Rock, several media outlets said, well, criminally, nothing will happen because Chris Rock doesn't want to press charges. That's not the way it works in California. In California, the elected district attorney, and in some cases, the city attorney for misdemeanors, but typically it's the district attorney, makes the determinations on a case-by-case basis or classification of crime basis that they will or will not prosecute certain types of crimes. And in that example, San Francisco, Los Angeles is much the same way. Low-level crimes, trespassing, things like that, the DA has simply just issued policies saying we're not going to prosecute those types of crimes. And property crimes, low-level property crimes, misdemeanor property crimes, if they're prosecuted, they're often prosecuted with very little consequence. What's tied to that as well is that those DAs in some of those jurisdictions are also proponents of early release or pretrial detention, a lack of pretrial detention. In other words, someone is arrested for whatever type of crime it might be, and historically there was a bail schedule that said you have to post a certain amount of bail before you're held in custody. And throughout the state of California, to varying degrees, people are now just being released without being detained. In the bail, in fairness, the bail system, the true cash bail system, is very flawed. In other words, it shouldn't just be your ability to pay that makes a determination on whether or not someone is held in custody. In the practical reality, the statutes and the California Constitution says it should be based on dangerousness. And we're kind of in a limbo area right now where it's from county to county the way it's actually being enforced. But the practical reality is in many jurisdictions like San Francisco, Los Angeles, only the most serious offenders are held in custody for any period of time. Most are simply released.
Wow. I'm surprised that we don't see more crimes in San Francisco and LA because
well, we're seeing quite a bit. I mean, you look at it now, and so this is a very complicated problem, and it's, or maybe probably the better word is a complex problem. How did the whole criminal justice system and how the different pieces fit together? The practical reality is, if law enforcement, frontline law enforcement officers know that they're going to go out and they're called to a Walgreens for shoplifting of, one of the more common ones now is large quantities of baby formula, because it can be resold very easily on the internet. So someone will go in and steal $800 of baby formula. They look like they're a sophisticated criminal. In other words, they've done it before, they've been arrested before. The frontline law enforcement officers know that if they arrest the person and book them into custody, the practical reality is they will still be writing police reports, and the person will have been released from custody at that point because of these various rules. So what ends up happening is the officers have an incentive, if they do get called, and we'll come back to that in a moment. If they get called, they have an incentive to tell, Walgreens, whatever the store is, do you really want me to arrest this person? I can just cite them and release them, or do nothing, because they're just going to get released. And what has happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that most retailers will not even report it. In other words, if you, in the state of California, if you go into Best Buy, if you go into Safeway, if you go into Pottery Barn, if you go into any one of these retailers that all of us have seen over and over again, that there are policies within these retail establishments that tell their employees, do not detain people for theft, particularly for low-level theft. It'll be the very unusual, large-scale, large quantities of alcohol, large quantities of tools, things like that. The retailers will detain people and contact law enforcement. But for most low-level offenses, when I say low-level, less than $950, most misdemeanor type offenses, there are specific policies with the retailers to not detain people. And I don't blame the retailers for that. And I've heard some pundits and politicians saying, well, why aren't the retailers contacting law enforcement and letting them know about this problem that's happening? But the retailers know, number one, nothing's going to happen to the person because law enforcement will come out and say, well, the DA is not going to prosecute this, or really not going to do anything. They won't get any real time. And the retailer is subject to civil liability for detaining the person. So in other words, there was a high profile case not too far from where I live a year or so ago where a Best Buy employee helped two sheriff's deputies detain an individual who was wanted and somewhat dangerous. The employee of Best Buy was told that they were going to be terminated for physically getting into a struggle with someone to help detain them, to help law enforcement. Best Buy, corporate Best Buy got a bunch of phone calls and then reversed that and said, no, the person should not have been fired. But from a practical standpoint, if you're a retailer, if you own, whatever type of retail or a chain of stores, and you can be sued when your employee detained someone and the allegation would be that they were too aggressive or whatever it might be. And at the same time, there was no practical consequence that was going to happen to that person in the first place. What the retailers have done is just say, well, it's the price of doing business, and we're just going to increase the cost. And so that's part of why you see Walgreens, all these different types of stores that in certain jurisdictions, San Francisco's most notably, they will look at it and they make a cost benefit analysis and say, we're getting too much property stolen from us. The store is no longer profitable. We'll just close the store. In other jurisdictions, they're just increasing the prices to cover the loss that they're suffering.
So that means there must be a scale of underreporting of crimes, right? Because I'm looking at the crimes, I'm comparing the number of crimes committed before and after 2014. I do see an increase, especially in property crimes in San Francisco, but not as stark as I expected. So I suspect it's because of the underreporting. Do you know like the scale of underreporting roughly?
Well,
you will never know, right?
Yeah, it's hard to get a number, and we've talked to the retailers associations about that. They don't want to release how much of an underreporting problem that they have, but it's exactly what you said. The underreporting is dramatic. So it's very important to understand when you look at property crime overall. You look at property crime since 2014 and how much it's gone up, and you say, well, it's not a stark increase, but it's an increase. But then if you actually dig into the numbers and look at property crime, such as car burglaries or car theft, and separate that out from the other types of property crimes. And the reason why I say separate that out is insurance companies, both here in California and throughout the United States, have had policies for many years that in order for a car burglary to be covered by your insurance, or a car theft to be covered by insurance, you have to make a report to local law enforcement. And so what has ended up happening in those is that most agencies here in California, you can make a police report for a car burglary or a car theft by telephone or some online. You can go online and say, hey, I parked my car out on this street and this place, and it was broken into. You fill out the paperwork, you say under penalty of perjury, this actually happened. You get a police report from that you can use and give to your insurance company. So the actual reporting of car burglaries and car thefts is somewhat accurate. I won't say it's completely accurate, but it's much more accurate. Sometimes people don't report to the insurance company because the loss isn't sufficient for that. But it's much more accurate. The increases on car burglary and car theft are staggering throughout California. The other types of crimes are underreported because there's no incentive to make a report.
Thank you for that. So the other day I walked by a car and it says, there's a sign on the window that says nothing to steal inside. Right. It was kind of funny, but also sad to see that.
A friend of mine was recently, he was speaking at something in San Francisco, and he's retired from law enforcement, and he was asking in terms of where should I park, things like that. And he was advised for the time that he was there to roll his windows down, leave nothing expensive in his car, and leave the windows down, because that way, if someone tried to do a car burglary, they would simply look and say, there's nothing in the car, there's nothing to do, they won't damage it, and they'll just go on. And I mean, and then on the other side of it, then we hear where people say, oh, you shouldn't have left expensive stuff in your car, or you shouldn't have done this, or you should, whatever type of, basically victim shaming. And the practical reality is the more we accept that it's okay and not holding people accountable for it, we're only going to get more of it over time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like that you mentioned the word accountability. I was just going to ask you probably to tell us your thoughts on the relationship between Prop 47 and the rising, the open air drug scenes, and also, the smash and grabs, and then the word that you just mentioned, accountability in California.
Yeah. So accountability is something that all of us as children should have learned from our families. In other words, whatever you do, good or bad, whatever behavior you engage in, there's a consequence for it. If you study, and you get very, very good grades, you apply to Stanford, and if you're lucky, you get in. If you don't, you're not going to go to a college like that. Those are consequences the same way. And accountability is nothing more. Accountability in the criminal justice system is nothing more than saying there's some people that have grown up and they've never been accountable for their actions in their life. And so they don't believe they're going to be held accountable. And what we have done in the last, as a result of Prop 47 and in realignment, we have basically told a large percentage of our communities that you didn't learn accountability as a child. Now you're an adult. If you want to take someone else's property, there will be no consequence. And it's taken a few years, but the thefts that we see, all of the stuff, behavior that's happening, the increased lawlessness is a result of telling people there will be no consequence for your action. There will be no accountability to you or for you for whatever you might do. And so as a result, it's the same people, a small percentage of society, that is stealing other people's property over and over again, breaking into cars, breaking into people's garages, taking their stuff. It is not a large percentage of society. And I don't mean to say that all of the homeless people are the people that are committing property crimes, because they're not. But all of it is interrelated. It is very much interrelated that people will steal to support a drug habit. People will steal to support themselves if they're homeless, if they need to. And as a society, at some point, we need to say, wait a second, we're going to hold people accountable for their actions. And that might mean that we're going to insist that they get off the drugs. We're going to insist that they take their medications if they've been arrested for a crime. And that's just simple accountability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So what about public camping? So I see there are two sides. Some people say, well, people don't have homes, and then therefore they're forced to sleep on the street, which I agree. But on the other hand, public camping also impose public health and public safety hazards. So how do we balance the two sides?
Yeah, it's a tough thing. And I agree with you completely that the public camping problem is, it's very easy for government to say, well, it's not our fault. But the practical reality is that you look at the housing that's been provided for people who are living homeless, regardless of what the reason is, and the amount of money that Los Angeles or San Francisco has thrown at this problem and produced very little. In other words, look at LA County, and they've spent, or the city of LA has spent a fortune supposedly to provide homeless housing, and they provided very few actual homes for people, and because of bureaucracy, because of mismanagement, because of all the things that government is is known for. But how do you balance that? And how do you have people living in the city of San Francisco, that you have people who live on the streets, who defecate on the street, and they're not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because there's a problem there. The problem is they can't afford a place to live. They can't. They're suffering from mental illness. They're suffering from drug addiction, whatever it might be. So at some point, we have to figure out a solution that provides people for some type of housing, but also ensures that they are going to have a place to live. They're going to have a place to live, but they're also going to be in rehab, or they're also going to be receiving the type of treatment that they need that's appropriate for them. It's a balance. And it's like with everything. I look at it, and the best analogy I can make is it's like an ecosystem. If you go into a rainforest and you change a part of the rainforest, there is a very good likelihood that you will unintentionally change something completely unrelated to the part that you were looking at. The one example is there were an overpopulation of I think it was in Florida, of frogs, and so they came up with a solution for how to minimize the frogs. Well, then they had an explosion of the types of insects that the frogs were eating and living off. And so what we did was we tinkered with the ecosystem when we did deinstitutionalization, and we didn't think about the consequences, the unintended consequences downstream. Same thing with Prop 47. It was well-intentioned. I really do think it was well-intentioned. It was recognition of saying we're incarcerating people that are low-level offenders, that are drug addicted or mentally ill, and we need to stop doing that. But you have to have a solution for the thing that created the problem, not just let's stop doing this bad thing without any practical solution for the underlying problem. And for the public camping, we have to find a way to house people. And the policy of the state of California for several years has been what's called housing first, to where we provide housing. Well, we've done a pretty poor job of providing that housing. But in addition to that, housing first, even where you provide housing, really doesn't work if you don't solve the problem and I'll just call it the underlying dysfunctionality that put the person in that position in the first place. You have to look at what those reasons are and take a holistic approach to say, is this a person who lost their job, and a single mom who's trying to support herself and doesn't have sufficient resources? Okay, that's one solution, and you deal with that one way. But if you have somebody who's chronically homeless because they're severely drug addicted or they're severely mentally ill, providing housing is not going to solve the problem.
That's right. So I heard there are some efforts to repeal Prop 47 in recent months, but has failed. So what are some of the main opposition to repeal the proposition?
So the main opposition to repealing Prop 47 is that it's reigniting over-incarceration. And I think if you stop and look at the types of offenses that we're talking about, the offenses that went from felonies to misdemeanors, they are the most low-level offenses, the people getting the shortest jail or prison sentences, and it's not causing repealing it would not cause over-incarceration. What it would do is it would reinvigorate, or it could serve as a catalyst to reinvigorate the drug courts and the behavioral health courts. Because what happened as a result of Prop 47 is the drug courts and the behavioral health courts essentially shut down. It used to be very robust courts in my county and in counties throughout California, that people would get arrested, types of Prop 47 type crimes, low-level felonies, and that the judge would say, hey, here's the consequence. I'm going to do flash incarceration on you for a week or 10 days. I'm going to sentence you to prison, whatever it might be. In the alternative, if you stay in drug court, if you go to rehab, that consequence is not going to happen. Same thing with behavioral health court. Those types of offenders were routed out of it. And I think the research is very strong that the behavioral health courts, the drug courts were very effective until the consequence was taken out of them by Prop 47.
I see. So now there are no drug courts. And then also there are pretty much very, very few drug treatment facilities in San Francisco. What about in your county?
We have them, but it's a similar type problem. It's just not to the same degree, I would say. We're in my county, in El Dorado County, there is some consequence. If you're getting arrested, it's not enough. So we have really, the drug courts have become essentially non-existent as a result of it. Because what ends up happening is that the person will understand from a practical standpoint, you get arrested for a low-level felony. You're in custody briefly. You get a public defender appointed for you. And the person says, the DA says, we want him to go to drug court. And here's the consequence. If you don't go to drug court, nothing will happen to you. And it used to be, you don't go to drug court, you might get 6 months in jail. You might get a 2-year state prison sentence where you serve half of it. And so the consequence was worse than drug court and rehab. That doesn't occur anymore. And to varying degrees throughout the state of California, those behavioral health courts have also gone away. There's some success. Sacramento County, Judge Larry Brown in Santa Clara County, there's a few judges that have had some degree of success working within the current framework, but it's very limited in comparison to what existed before.
Wait, so when you say they have limited success, like what do you mean? Like they were able to order people to receive some kind of mandatory treatments?
Yeah, one of the best examples, I think, and I think it would be ideal for your program too, is to sit down and talk to Judge Brown, who has been recognized as really a leader in this, in finding ways to encourage people to stay within behavioral health court and or rehab. He's been very successful and very creative in that. I think it's much, much more difficult today because of the repeal of the passage of Prop 47 and the changes in those laws, as well as others than it was before.
I see.
But there's some successes there, and I think it's worth and important to acknowledge that.
I see. This question was not on my list, but just kind of came to my mind. We saw the really sad news of, not really news, like a couple of months ago, a UCLA graduate student was stabbed to death by a homeless person in a furniture store, right? And then it turned out the person has a long record of crimes on him. So as a normal person, I have no idea how the criminal justice system works. How can that kind of person walk freely on the street?
Well, because of everything we've been talking about, it really is that there's a very small percentage of people that are committing crimes over and over again, and there is no accountability for their actions. And oftentimes, and I think in that case is one, there's a combination of significant mental illness with a significant drug problem. And very often what happens is they just progressively get worse until they do something particularly heinous like this. And what we need to do is find a way to intervene before it gets to that point. It shouldn't be that someone can be arrested over and over again or identified as a person committing low-level crimes over and over again, getting worse and worse and worse over a period of time, and then ultimately committing something like, murdering some young student this way. But anybody who's been in the system, the criminal justice system, knows it is the same people over and over again, oftentimes getting progressively worse in terms of the actions and what they're engaged in because of everything we've been talking about.
So if they have committed crimes over and over again. Why couldn't we just hold? I mean, they're not like low level crimes. Why couldn't we just hold them in jail or someplace?
Well, we should be, and you know, there is a problem with there's a problem with the statutes. There's a problem with some of the DAs. I mean, just be frank. I mean, George Gascon is someone who I know and I've known for many years, and I don't know how else to put it. I mean, he was a police officer. He's been a DA. He's been around the criminal justice system for many years, but he simply demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of the way the criminal justice system works, to where he thinks if you don't arrest someone like this type of person who's committed an offense, a lower level offense, then they're less likely to reoffend. And I just don't understand where the logic and reason. So there, you know, part of it's the statutes, part of it is a handful of these DAs in a few bigger, larger jurisdictions, and their unwillingness to hold people accountable for their actions.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess my two last questions. The last serious question is, we know there's the organized drug trade in San Francisco in the Tenderloin area. So who should be intervening this, like FBI or DEA? Who should be intervening?
Well, it should be the city and county of San Francisco. They have the responsibility. I hear that, you know, suggestions, well, the FBI needs to come in, the DEA, the federal government needs to come in. It's like, this is a local problem, and a local law enforcement solution should deal with, should deal with that problem. The practical reality is, in San Francisco, significantly more people died from drug overdoses or drug poisoning, probably the better way to describe it, from fentanyl during COVID than died from COVID. It's a staggering number of people that have overdosed on fentanyl. And we know that fentanyl is flowing into the United States from our southern border. We're doing very little to stop it. In San Francisco, someone who thinks they're using, you know, they bought Xanax on the street, or they bought whatever controlled substance, the practical reality is the likelihood that it's actually laced with fentanyl is very high, because it's less expensive. So you make more money if you're a drug dealer on it. And as a government, looking the other way and pretending like it's not happening. I mean, the solution seems to be in San Francisco is that let them do it. We know that there is a large number of fentanyl poisonings that will happen, but as long as we have enough Narcan, you know, the drug that's used for that type of, as long as we have enough Narcan, we can save people. And I just don't agree with that. I think it's the wrong-headed approach, that it is a local approach that needs to be, it's not okay. You can't do that. And I say that as somebody who supported, for the most part, I supported medical marijuana, and then ultimately the legalization of marijuana. I think it is, here in California, I think it needs to be regulated properly. I'm not talking about that type of controlled substances. I'm talking about people using heroin and other more aggravated types of offenses. We have to somehow put an end to that and stop it. And pretending like mitigating the harm is going to solve a problem is just silly.
Thank you. I guess my last question is, if there's only one thing that you can change tomorrow, this is a silly question, like a sixth grade question. If there's only one thing you can change tomorrow, like what would it be? Make the whole thing better.
Yeah, what I would change was to permit us to have, and the courts in particular, to have a consequence for failure to comply with drug court or behavioral health court. That's what I would do. We need to be able to give judges a consequence, a real consequence for drug courts and behavioral health courts, in order to get, you know, to deal with this explosion of homelessness that we're all seeing.
Thank you. Well, Vern, thank you so much for speaking with me today. This is great.
My pleasure, and thank you very much. I appreciate the questions. A very interesting conversation.